So I always just want to first start out and just you can pop it into the chat and just share what type of practice are you? Are you a dietitian or what demographic? What type of practitioner are you is what I'm trying to say. I love to see that.
Dietitian.
Just yeah, dietitians and Christina can monitor that. I love getting an idea of the range of practitioners just because all of us are in this world of functional medicine and it's become such a fun world to practice in and a really fun world for those of us who entered into it a little bit later in a whole new learning spectrum. And the microbiome is part of that because it's such a new science. So as you guys pop that in, Christina, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. Really excited to be here. Christina O'Connor. I am also a registered dietitian. Hey, dietitians. So I've been with Pendulum for about 2 years now. I manage all of our healthcare relationships. I started my career in the NICU, which is where I fell in love with microbiome science, all things gut microbiome related. I have two boys, and I'm over here on the East Coast in Virginia.
And I am Kara. I'm also a dietitian, but hello to everyone. We've got lots of different practitioners here. And I am the senior manager of scientific communication. So, love talking about the science, love talking to other clinicians. I'm located in Denver. I have more than 10 years in clinical practice. I spent the last couple years working in another microbiome focused company. So, I'm just all about the microbiome and enjoyed joining the Pendulum team because we have some really cool science. So I'm excited to talk about all that today. Okay, so I think for the most part, we're all here and can absolutely agree that this area of microbiome research is really very exciting, right? And we generally now have this overall understanding of how the microbiome is essentially connected to all bodily systems. And that's really because we know the microbiome has such a diverse range of functions from aiding in the synthesis of uh, and regulation, really, of our hormones and neurotransmitters, facilitating digestion and absorption of our nutrients. We know the microbiome plays such a key role in regulating and supporting our immune system, but it also contributes to the regulation of estrogen levels in our body. So, our focus for today, especially in regards to this area of women's health, is really focusing on the microbiome's influence on this sort of inevitable part of a woman's life, which is that transition into menopause. I read a pretty eye opening statistic recently that said that given our current life expectancy, women will spend almost 3 decades of life postmenopausal. Oh, I just want to, looks like they need access. Oh, okay. So hopefully someone's on the back end helping you guys out with access to the slides. Okay. But anyway, given this current life expectancy, that women will spend almost 3 decades of life postmenopausal. So this is a huge period of a woman's life. And this time of life and this natural movement into this phase is really met with an increased risk of metabolic conditions, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and these changes to our metabolism. And it's really due to this change and decline in our hormones, as well as these natural microbial shifts that occur that really start to impact our quality of life. This includes our eating behaviors, as well as food cravings, and really leans into this societal challenge that women face during this time of life. So, first, I just want to set the stage to really go into depth as far as what does it actually mean to have a healthy and resilient microbiome? So, as the current research really stands, we don't really have a true definition of the microbial signature profile that resembles exactly a healthy microbiome, but we do have these very specific characteristics that we know are necessary to maintain the structure and the function of our microbiome. And one of the most important characteristics is this mucosal barrier and having a very strong mucosal barrier. So, a healthy microbiome has this diverse range of species. We have lots of these keystone species or these key beneficial species, keystone species, and we're going to talk a lot about them today, and specifically Akkermansia. But these are like your microbiome Instagram influencers, or I think of them as like your star players on a basketball team. So, the Steph Currys and LeBron James, right? They really are there to help drive the success of the team. So, keystone species are very similar in that they make up a small portion of the microbiome, but they really have a huge impact on the overall health. And they produce these key metabolites that play such an essential role in the health of our mucosal barrier, in the health of our immune system, and as well as our metabolic health, which we'll talk a lot more about. So, what are the signs of a dysfunctional or an imbalance in the microbiome? So, obviously, we're going to potentially see digestive issues like gas and bloating and more food sensitivities. But we're also going to potentially see these metabolic issues start to take place. We have issues from brain fog, anxiety, and depression. But we also, as we've now come to learn, that we start to see hormonal imbalances as well. And this is really because of that loss of diversity of these keystone and short chain fatty acid producing strains like Akkermansia and butyrate producing bacteria, which really drives dysbiosis, this imbalance in the microbial ecosystem that ultimately sets the stage for this thinning mucosal layer to take place, where we start to see weakened or compromised tight junctions. So those fence posts are getting knocked out. And so your microbiome is essentially not protected, or your immune system is not being protected. And this really starts to drive inflammation in the intestines, all of which trigger inflammatory responses to occur, not just in the gut, but also beyond. And so the health of our microbiome, and especially as we start to enter these phases of life that are naturally met with hormonal changes, this really determines the path of estrogen. And we know estrogen plays such an important role throughout a woman's lifetime, as does the microbiome. And both our hormones and our microbiome can be modulated by these external factors, or what we call this exposome. And your exposome are all these external factors that we're exposed to, like dietary changes, the typical standard American diet, these low fiber diets, high saturated fat, lots of sugar, different medications like antibiotics and PPIs that we know drive these changes in the microbiome, lifestyle factors, infections, and all of this is not just impacting the health of the microbiome, but also our hormonal health. And so as we really start to approach this last major hormonal shift in life, menopause, right, we're faced with ultimately this natural decline in our microbiome health because we start to see this natural decline as we start to age, but also because of this sharp decline in our hormones. It becomes a very important time to bring attention to the health of the microbiome and to really think about ways we can start to improve the overall strength and resiliency. And as our hormones are naturally shifting and changing, and we get to this natural decline in hormones, this menopause phase, or this decline that occurs during menopause, this really plays into a lot of the symptoms that start to develop. But if we also have an unhealthy microbiome, so if we start to enter this phase of life and we've already lost that diversity, or this exposome has really disrupted that foundation already, and we're starting to see a dysfunctional gut take place, then we're really setting the stage for these worse clinical outcomes to take place and a greater chance of developing some of these really unwanted symptoms. So more weight gain, and of course, driving this increased risk of metabolic conditions like diabetes, which is what we call it, but diabetes and obesity, as well as osteoporosis. I'm by no means a hormone expert. I would definitely say I spent the majority of my career in gastrointestinal health, but as we know, these things are all intertwined, and we look to specific interventions like hormone replacement therapy that are there to obviously help manage symptoms, especially in the case of menopause. But we also have hormone replacement therapy that exists throughout other periods of life, like birth control, which there's a lot of research now to support the shifting and changing of the microbiome that happens with birth control and really being a dysbiosis risk factor. And so I think of my patients that can sometimes say, oh, I've had GI issues for the last like 10, 15 years, and really can trace it back to when they started birth control. But even with other hormonal therapies, transdermal patches or topical creams and lubricants, the success of them is actually also really dependent on the health of the microbiome, and the absorption of some of these topical treatments can really be impacted by our microbiome. So if you're finding that these patients are not necessarily responding to these therapies and you're having to go higher and higher on the dose, ultimately we have to start looking back and looking at the gut and finding out if there's issues in the gut that are impacting this. And it ultimately comes down to the fact that our gut microbiome obviously plays a key role in not just estrogen, but really this metabolism of estrogen. And so this brings us to estrogen, the estrogen microbiome, or what we call the estrobolome, which I would say is probably one of my most favorite terms now in the microbiome world. But this is just two words, your estrogen microbiome combined. And this is the part of the microbiome that is responsible or handles whether or not you're going to reabsorb estrogen back into your body. So if you're a man or if you're a woman and you are done with an estrogen, and it's essentially, I like how Dr. Carey puts it, it's been packaged up in a box with a bow and sent through detoxification. Once it gets into the intestines, it's supposed to essentially get out and be excreted. But the estrobolome, which is this network of bacteria that produce enzymes, and specifically this beta glucuronidase, that's capable of recycling those estrogens that are marked for excretion And what it does is it puts it back into circulation. So if your estrobolome is dysfunctional, meaning we have an imbalance, then what it does is it unties those bows and it lifts the lid and essentially sends those estrogens back out to get reabsorbed into the body. So both men and women that, have issues with estrogen, it's not because of necessarily how they produce it or if they're not producing it, but it could really root back to the health of the microbiome, and it's essentially causing estrogen to become reabsorbed. So what does this look like clinically? On a test, a lot of us are familiar with beta glucuronidase, which is the enzyme that we look at that essentially is responsible for untying that bow and lifting the lid off that allows estrogens then to be free. So the more beta glucuronidase or the higher your beta glucuronidase is essentially saying more of those boxes are getting undone and there's more estrogens getting back into circulation that are floating around. Or if you're looking at other types of tests that look at microbial functions, a high estrobolome essentially is a marker for beta glucuronidase. And it's not all that bad. Like everything else in the microbiome, there's this like Goldilocks phenomenon that takes place. So it's not like we want no beta glucuronidase. It's needed, it's essential for other purposes. But when it's really high, that's when we're going to see potentially higher estrogen dominant symptoms. So a reduced or low beta glucuronidase activity decreases that deconjugation or essentially unties that bow. Just thinking about detoxification, right? Estrogen goes into the liver. We have phase 1, phase 2. And then that's when it gets shipped through bile and gets into the intestine. So if you have low circulating estrogen or you have this low beta glucuronidase, then we know this is linked to some clinical outcomes like obesity and metabolic syndrome, menopause symptoms. We're potentially going to see irregular periods and hot flashes, mood changes. But this increased beta glucuronidase then is essentially telling us or potentially showing us that too much estrogen that's marked for excretion is getting put back into circulation. So we know this is linked to certain types of hormone cancers, of course, other symptoms related to menopause and PMS symptoms and fibroids. So really thinking of those more estrogen dominant states that can lead to more weight gain and again, changes in your cycle. But this is really pointing back to an issue with the estrobolome. A lot of times when we see that low circulating or low beta glucuronidase or no beta glucuronidase, again, to me, it just alerts that, hey, there's something going on in that phase 3 or that microbiome part of the process, and whether it's diversity, whether we're really missing these key species that we know are essential for a healthy microbiome. So there are various changes that take place in the microbiota before and after hormonal shifts like menopause. And so it's really important that we begin to optimize the microbiome and we start to build diversity of these key strains. So this is just one study that had a pretty robust sample size, 2,300 participants. And essentially what they found was they saw this menopause transition as a very important period with increased cardiometabolic risk. And they also found specifically related to akkermansia that this was specifically, or in this patient population, that akkermansia was depleted. And we know akkermansia has a key role, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the role of the microbiome, but this study also talked about a positive association with healthy estrogen levels and akkermansia. So as we talk further about it, again, optimizing the microbiome, building the diversity of these key species like akkermansia definitely offers a protective measure as women potentially move into this hormonal transition and supporting the estrobolome. And so they also found in this study, they looked at the overall diversity, which was lower compared to premenopausal women. So we know that this transition is marked by a decrease in diversity, which this drives dysbiosis and starts to really set the stage for intestinal permeability and that intestinal inflammation to take place. And they also found that with the declining hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that there was also an associated decrease and decline in that barrier integrity and the overall health of the intestinal mucosa. So again, really showing that as we reduce the abundance of these keystone and short chain fatty acid producing strains, and we start to see this weakened tight junction take place, that we're really giving into inflammation and immune activation to start to happen. And part of the understanding is we know estrogen and progesterone have protective measures within the gut, and we know that they help to enhance gastrointestinal integrity. We know that they can alter gastrointestinal transit time. So we see this very clear and often in women with changing hormones, especially during menopause, where we see such like an increase in constipation, right? We know that that's such a common symptom that takes place as we have this decline in hormones or these change in hormones. And it can often be linked back to this slowing of the intestinal transit time. And then, of course, if we think about constipation, if you're not pooping, you're not detoxifying. So this further drives dysfunction to the estrobolome in really getting rid of some of those estrogens that are marked for excretion and removal. So constipation increases that risk of them being reabsorbed. So this was a study that again also found reduced akkermansia, reduced short chain fatty acid production and short chain fatty acid producing bacteria, which we know is a key function to reducing metabolic disorders like diabetes and obesity. And that's because akkermansia is really important in supporting serotonin production, which we know it plays a role in glucose balance. But akkermansia also lowers pro-inflammatory cytokines that are often linked to diabetes and obesity, as well as having robust short-chain fatty acid production, especially butyrate, is essential for GLP-1 production, which we'll talk more about, and that's key for glucose homeostasis. Skeletal muscle mass, this is another important indicator of metabolic health. And we know that a loss or low muscle mass is associated with being less metabolically sound. So this was a study that looked at over 480 healthy menopausal women. And what they found was that the gut microbiome, and obviously being a key player and related to skeletal muscle mass, but essentially what they found was in this patient population where we know there's this natural loss of skeletal muscle mass, they found that having higher microbially derived butyrate was associated with improved skeletal muscle mass. And butyrate, which obviously plays such an important role and has lots of key functions in the body, it's the primary fuel for our colonocytes, but we know butyrate also improves insulin sensitivity. And this is most likely through the production of GLP-1. So we know butyrate binds to those G protein coupled receptors, and that stimulates production and release of GLP-1. But GLP-1 is known to alter muscle vasculature, which increases both blood volume and blood flow in insulin sensitive healthy people. So it's important for us to bring focus and to really pay attention to these key short chain fatty acid producing bacteria like Akkermansia, which produces propionate, and that can make butyrate, but also species like Clostridium butyricum or Calibacterium prausnitzii, because we know that obviously obesity, diabetes, and especially this postmenopause transition is associated with a loss of diversity in these very important species. So I know we've been focusing on menopause, but I added this slide in because obviously there's other hormonal dysregulations that take place that are linked back and related to the estrobolome and related to dysfunction and imbalances in the microbiome. And insulin resistance and PCOS are also part of that equation. So having this lower gut diversity, whether it's because of this exposome, all the things we're exposed to that drive dysfunction to the gut because of hormonal changes, right? This feedback loop that is a natural working system of the body. But this lower diversity and this increased gut permeability leads to the translocation. So as you start to knock down those fence posts, as you get that weakened tight junctions, then bacteria and bacterial toxins like lipopolysaccharide, which we know is a driver of inflammation, increases the risk of endotoxemia. And that essentially leads to activation of the immune system, coupled with this loss of short chain fatty acid producing bacteria, with this loss of endogenous butyrate production, all really have been shown to drive increased insulin resistance and obesity and really play into the pathogenesis of PCOS. And so as we're faced with these fluctuating hormonal changes and microbiome changes, the question really comes down to how can we best optimize our microbiome health and really start to improve outcomes and maybe even prevent some of the microbial changes that can take place, hopefully improving the symptoms and also improving outcome or likelihood of these associated conditions like diabetes, like obesity, that so often co-occur with these hormonal shifts and especially this shift into menopause. So let's look at specific microbiota that play a key role in this process. So I want to first talk about Akkermansia. So Akkermansia on this picture here on the left side. So the role of Akkermansia, which is this keystone star player of the microbiome, really the mechanism of action is twofold with Akkermansia. It first regulates the mucin layer and plays a key role in the integrity of the gut barrier. And then second, it plays a key function in stimulating the production of GLP-1s. Akkermansia resides in the mucin layer and it consumes mucin, but it really eats away at that mucosal barrier to regenerate and rebuild new mucus. So really helping to keep that regeneration. Akkermansia also secretes three key molecules. So it has three key byproducts that are also essential in not just the barrier integrity, but some of the metabolic benefits. So the first one is this A-muc1100. This is a surface protein on Akkermansia, and it binds to these TLR2 receptors, which trigger our goblet cells. Our goblet cells are the cells that produce mucin, and it triggers those goblet cells to produce more mucin to rebuild that mucosal barrier. And this in turn plays a key role in supporting immune homeostasis. It also is essential in preventing that translocation of harmful substances and bacterial toxins like LPS from getting into systemic circulation. So preventing that endotoxemia from taking place and really ultimately keeping low-grade chronic inflammation from happening. And so this essentially results in less inflammatory load as well as a more regulated immune response. Akkermansia also produces propionate. This is a short-chain fatty acid that can be converted into butyrate. And of course, we already mentioned some, and we'll talk a little bit more, but butyrate has far-reaching effects. It's only generated by the gut microbiome, and it's the primary source of fuel for our colonocytes. It binds to those G protein receptors to stimulate the release of GLP-1. And then finally, Akkermansia also secretes a protein called P9. P9 binds to other receptors on our intestinal L cells. Those are the cells that produce GLP-1, what's known as ICAM2 receptors. And that also stimulates the release and production of GLP-1. This next image, so here on the right, we have no Akkermansia or we have low Akkermansia. So we see two things happening. We see this thinning of the mucosal layer. We start to see the weakening of these tight junctions from taking place. And now there's a direct opening or link to the epithelium to get into the immune system. So if we don't have Akkermansia or we have very low Akkermansia, then those short-chain fatty acid pathways are affected. You don't get that P9 secretion. We don't get the consumption of the mucin that helps to improve that barrier integrity, but we also don't have that GLP-1 production. And so this is the same image we just saw, but this always comes up in a lot of questions about Akkermansia, especially as Akkermansia has been brought to the market. And live Akkermansia is really important because live bacteria means you get all of the benefits and you get all of the microbial activity that that strain or that bacteria is supposed to do. So whereas on the right, you have pasteurized, and pasteurization just means dead. So the strain's essentially been heat processed and killed, so it breaks down all those cell walls. So with pasteurized Akkermansia, you aren't getting a fully functioning bacteria. You get some of this A-muc1100, so it helps to rebuild some of that mucosal barrier, but you don't get the full mucin regulation since live Akkermansia is only able to consume mucin, right? Dead strains don't consume anything because they're dead, essentially. So with that pasteurized Akkermansia, you cannot consume mucin. You also lose the production of short-chain fatty acids, so you lose that propionate production. And you also don't get that production of P9, which is that very important protein that stimulates the release of GLP-1. So you're not getting any of the GLP-1 benefits that we see Akkermansia doing. So again, live bacteria and live Akkermansia specifically contains all of the beneficial bacteria components, plus the ability for it to establish that intricate crosstalk with our diet, with other members of the microbiome, and as well as the benefits with us, the human host. So Clostridium butyricum, this is another novel strain that's a very prominent butyrate producer. It also strengthens the gut barrier. It also improves metabolic health because it's such a strong butyrate producer. Lots of studies showing that supplementation with Clostridium butyricum, how it increases fecal butyrate concentrations, but it also helps to facilitate the proliferation of other butyrate-producing bacteria. So again, working together to correct for that dysbiosis. But because butyrate also helps to stimulate that mucin, helps to improve that gut barrier, then again, preventing translocation of pathogenic and toxic toxins like LPS from getting into the intestinal epithelium and really driving that inflammation. We also talk about Bifidobacterium infantis. Now, this is a strain that gets a lot of discussion as being a keystone strain primarily in the developing infants. It's one of the first strains that seeds the infant microbiome. But we talk a lot about Bifidobacterium because these are primary fermenters. And so these are really important when it comes to that initial fermentation of our dietary fibers. So I think about a lot of patients who come in and they're like, I started eating healthy and I can't tolerate any of these foods, or I react more to more fibrous foods. And a lot of times people think back to, oh, it must be the types of carbohydrates or the types of fibers, but sometimes it really comes down to who isn't there. And so these primary fermenters are important because they can really help then do that initial breakdown of the dietary fibers. So then these other novel and keystone strains can produce those short chain fatty acids. And we know as we transition to this postmenopausal state, we're met with this sort of increased risk of metabolic dysfunction, both due to the declining hormones and this loss of microbiome resiliency, loss of barrier integrity, loss of these short chain fatty acid producing bacteria and keystone strains like Akkermansia, which we see very common in postmenopausal women. And as we've been discussing, this really sets the stage for metabolic dysfunction to take place, especially seeing this increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes. I love this image in this study. This was a very early study done back in 2013 in the microbiome space, and it really just gave a direct understanding of the role the microbiome plays in influencing our risk of metabolic conditions. So this was a study that basically took the microbiome of an obese subject, and then they implanted it into a lean mouse, or transplanted, I should say, into a lean mouse, and that lean mouse then became obese. They then, whoops, they then took the microbiome from a lean subject and they transplanted that microbiome into an obese mouse, and that obese mouse then became lean. Okay, so that kind of keyed these researchers in and said, okay, that's pretty interesting. So then they took the microbiome from this newly lean mouse, transplanted it into the newly obese mouse, and that obese mouse then became lean. So we're seeing this relationship between microbiomes. And what I find so interesting about this study is that the two subjects were actually identical twins, or they were twins. And so they were genetically the same. Their microbiomes were different. And that's why our microbiomes are so unique to us. But despite their genes and everything else being similar, their microbiomes were able to directly impact and influence the metabolic state of these mice. So again, just really honing in on the microbiome's role in this sort of metabolic crosstalk. So this was a study we did here at Pendulum, and this is on our pendulum glucose control. This is a probiotic that contains 5 different strains. We have 3 butyrate producing strains. That includes that Clostridium butyricum, Akkermansia, as well as Bifidobacterium infantis. And this was a 12-week double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial. And basically what we were looking at was changes in blood sugar and changes in A1C in that area under the curve. So that's just an area under the glucose curve, which is a measurement of glucose after a standardized meal tolerance test. And what they found, there was 3 arms. So they did a placebo, and they also just had 3 strains. So just the 3 butyrate producing strains. And then the final arm was with our pendulum glucose control, which is all 5. And we'll talk about those a little bit more. But what you can see is that the placebo, obviously there was a change and there was an increase during that time, but there was a significant change to postprandial meal spikes. So that decreased by 33% with pendulum glucose control. A1C actually lowered by 0.6%, which we think about that. And if you don't necessarily work in diabetes management or care, sometimes we're like, oh, that doesn't sound like so much, but that's enough to really take someone from being diabetic to pre-diabetic, from pre-diabetic to non-diabetic. And when we look at the change that we see over the course of even common diabetes medications, it falls in line with what we see with, say, metformin or with some of your other very common sulfonylureas and diabetes medications. And then we also found in the study that this 5-strain pendulum glucose control that included Akkermansia was very safe. It was well tolerated throughout all study participants. And then we did a follow-up to that study, basically trying to get another understanding of some of the mechanisms that are taking place. And what they found was specifically looking at Clostridium butyricum, which is that prominent butyrate producing that novel strain that, again, is often not as robust or abundant in the microbiome, that this was actually able to convert CDCA, which is a primary bile acid, chenodeoxycholic acid, to UTGA, right, ursodeoxycholic acid, which is a secondary bile acid, which plays a key role in also stimulating the production of GLP-1. And it's through blocking of the FXR receptor that essentially promotes GLP-1 production. So it's not just through the production of butyrate, which we know helps to enhance GLP-1 production, but it's also the production of this secondary bile acid UTGA that really supports GLP-1 secretion to not only help with reducing food cravings and changing some of the appetite control, but also really playing a key role into reducing blood sugar and A1C levels. So this is a study that from out of the American Gut Project that basically looked at over 10,000 participants. This was a huge study. They had lots of different outcomes, but one of the outcomes they looked at was related to obesity. And they basically found that higher Akkermansia levels, so in fact, 10% higher Akkermansia can actually reduce risk of obesity on average by 26%. So just showing that the more Akkermansia, the greater reduction of obesity that took place. And this was independent of age, sex, smoking, alcohol, drinking. So all of those exposome, those factors that impact the microbiome. And then finally, I love this study really just because our goal, at least my goal, I don't want to speak for everyone, but our goal in functional medicine is to ultimately make people healthier and really get at the root of what's driving a lot of these dysfunctions. And that's really where I consider the microbiome key. It's really part of that sort of three-legged stool. But this study basically showed that obese individuals that had higher Akkermansia levels, it basically shifted them to a more metabolically healthier state, even independent of weight loss, right? Of course, we want to lose weight. Everyone wants to feel good. But truth be told, we really want people to be healthier. So the fact that these people were still obese, but greater Akkermansia was actually correlated with a more metabolically sound state, to me is just really cool and shows the profound impact that our microbiome has. So with that, I'm gonna toss it to Christina to take you guys through some other studies and that we've done at Pendulum.
Awesome. Yeah, if you guys could do me a favor and put your questions, we've got some really great questions coming in that we'll get to those at the end. So keep putting them in the Q&A to help us keep track. All right. So yes, we're going to talk about some of the key probiotic strains in our pendulum products that have been studied in food cravings. 8% of women experience food guilt. I don't know about you guys, but I certainly do, especially when I'm trying to work out and track my food and I'm doing really well. And then I give in to a craving and I'm like, gosh, I really wish that I hadn't done that. I enjoy it in the moment, but then you're always like bummed. Um, so a lot of times people will think I just can't resist my food cravings. They're just too strong. And so therefore I don't have any willpower and I won't be able to lose weight. And I think that what we don't understand is that a lot of times your food cravings are related to dysbiosis going on in the gut. And so it doesn't really have anything to do with your lack of willpower. It has to do with those organisms in the gut sending signals to the brain, hey, we're in charge. And the things that we need to survive are high fat foods, high sugar, refined carbohydrates. And so they're driving your food choices. And so when you restore the organisms that are meant to do the job of metabolism and regulate and restore balance, like the strains that are in the pendulum products that feed on things like fiber and polyphenols, we get so much feedback from patients and healthcare providers with patients that are taking our products with the change that they're having in their food cravings. We hear the most hilarious things like, I enjoyed eating a salad today, or I'm finding myself reaching for fruits and vegetables and I've never done that before, or I'm able to eat 2 cookies and I no longer feel like the cookie monster. So it's important to recognize that when we are modulating the microbiome through supplementation, the food cravings can be alleviated. So we'll go on to the next slide. So in this graphic here, you can see GLP-1 probiotic. This is a mechanism of action. Like, how are these strains actually increasing GLP-1? And I think that Kara already touched on this, but just review. So things like this Clostridium butyricum, this green guy all the way up here at the top, and Bifidobacterium infantis, as well as Akkermansia. When we consume fiber, these strains are fermenting that fiber. And the result of that fermentation process is short chain fatty acid production. So you're thinking about things like you can see acetate, propionate, and then of course, most importantly, butyrate. And some of you are asking the question I see in the Q&A, is it beneficial to just take butyrate? I know a lot of practitioners that will recommend just taking a butyrate supplement. I tend to think that this is far more effective because you're restoring the organisms whose main function it is to produce butyrate. And so this is what they do. This is what they live for. And so that butyrate has the ability to bind to the intestinal L cells. There are butyrate receptor sites on those cells. And so when butyrate is present, it binds, and that relationship stimulates the GLP-1 hormone naturally. And so that's how patients that are taking our products to some degree are experiencing better insulin secretion, more sensitivity to insulin. They have better gastric emptying. They have reduced inflammation. And so it's really exciting to see. We'll go on to the next slide, please. So we here at Pendulum are dedicated to doing the research, right? We want to have the research that backs up the strains and the probiotics that we're manufacturing. So we did a study that is actually still ongoing. We enrolled 274 participants, and after 6 weeks, we wanted to look at and collect the data, which is what we did. And we gave them something called the Food Cravings, Validated Food Cravings Questionnaire. And so it asked them about their food cravings for all the craveable things, right? Okay, so it's sugars, carbohydrates, high fat foods, high fat fast food foods. And so this is what we found. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. 91% of the study participants, and again, it was 274 in total, reported that they had a reduction in their food cravings. Next slide. And so, what you can see here is that people that had really high food cravings at baseline experienced a greater reduction. However, it still works for those people who have like really mild food cravings, which I would put myself in that category. I don't have super intense food cravings, but it does come on every once in a while. And I do love salt. I know Kara is in the salt gang too. Yeah, we like love a French fry and they're never salty enough, right? Like I can always add salt and then it's perfect. However, when I'm taking these strains in any of these products, I notice that things taste appropriately too salty, which is not something that I've ever said in my entire life. I had some Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets with my kids the other day, and I took one bite and I was like, wow, these are really salty. So it works for people who just have mild food cravings as well. Slide. And so the key takeaway is that in every single category, so right, so we have carbs and starches, fast food fats, high fat foods, and sweets. And it was statistically significant in all of these categories. So we reached out to healthcare providers and we surveyed them. We wanted to get their thoughts on how are you using this GLP-1 probiotic in clinical practice, especially with all of the GLP-1 injections and medications and their recent rise. And we here at Pendulum felt like it was important to create a probiotic that was called GLP-1, right? Because we've been having this GLP-1 conversation since our inception. This is the work that we've been doing since our very first study on our glucose control. We've been trying to increase GLP-1 naturally. And so we felt like it was really important to put that out there that so that people understand that there is a way to increase your GLP-1 naturally. So healthcare providers, 97% of the healthcare providers that we surveyed said that using the GLP-1 probiotic has helped with a smooth transition off of the GLP-1 injections, right? It's ended up being like an off ramp. It helps with the food cravings once they've completely stopped the medication because you're fixing the root cause. You're fixing the problem, the dysbiosis, and healing the gut that's causing the food cravings in the first place. Next slide. 78% of the healthcare providers that we surveyed are using the GLP-1 probiotic as a strategy to help patients transition off of GLP-1 medications. 64% of them are using it as a first line approach, right? So instead of doing the injections, they're using the probiotics just as a starting place, right? Let's see if we can heal the gut and then maybe we don't need the injections. And then 53% of the healthcare providers that we surveyed are using the GLP-1 probiotic in combination with GLP-1 medications. So we have a few case studies that we're going to show you here. And this is after taking the Pendulum glucose control product. And this is the product that has our clinical studies tied to it in type 2 diabetics, where we were able to lower A1C and postprandial glucose spikes. So for this particular 65-year-old menopausal female patient with type 2 diabetes, she was down 3 pounds after taking the glucose control and was actually able to lower her fasting blood glucose from 169 to 135. And again, that's after a 3-month period of time. Some of her perceived improvements were better gut health, improved A1C, less sugar cravings, and then, of course, less glucose spikes. Another patient, 68-year-old menopausal female with type 2 diabetes, down 4 pounds, was able to lower her fasting blood glucose from 126 to 98 after 3 months. And she noticed a reduction in sugar cravings, better control over her appetite, and less abdominal discomfort. So in summary, just to wrap it up and put a bow on it, and then we'll get to some of your questions. Understanding the role of the gut microbiome and its involvement in women's health is essential to support these various conditions. The health of the gut microbiome is key to a well-functioning estrobolome, such a fun word. Imbalance and reduced presence of keystone strains like Akkermansia and Clostridium butyricum that we've been talking about is necessary for a healthy microbiome, directly affects metabolic health. And promoting gut barrier integrity and having these strains that are available to support short chain fatty acid production and metabolic health, promoting the Akkermansia and the Clostridium butyricum and Bifidobacterium infantis is a crucial part of female gut microbiome support. So we have a special code for everyone, WS Rupa Health 40, and that's going to give you $40 off of your wholesale order. So keep in mind that these are already discounted to the wholesale price, and this is just going to give you an additional $40 off of your wholesale order.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.